Well, I think it's true with everyone who tells their story of how Meher Baba brought them into the world of his love. This story is, of course, very precious to me. And it covers a big span of time. And I've told it enough times that I know the important parts to include. So I'm going to say that I was raised in a family who didn't really have any spiritual inclinations. And my parents sent me to a, what was it called at the time? Unitarian Universalist church in a small town way out at the end of Long Island. And because they felt that me and my other siblings ought to have some kind of religious education, I guess. And so we were really fortunate that that's what they chose. We read things like Socrates and Plato and in Sunday school, and we did read stories about Jesus and the Gospels and that type of thing, but it was all presented in a very intellectual manner. And however, in the sanctuary of that church was a larger than life size mural of Jesus walking down a mountain path with two sort of homeless looking men sitting, holding their heads, obviously in great despair about something. And that was what we saw in the sanctuary. And I sang in the choir. I love to sing. And so I saw it often enough. And there was something about the painting I liked a lot. I remember mostly Jesus' arms were outspread. And he wasn't looking at the men. It was as if he wasn't quite upon them yet, but he was looking right out at us. And that's really all I could say about my childhood upbringing in terms of any spiritual or religious upbringing. And yet when I got to college, I chose to take psychology as a major because it was the most interesting course I'd had in high school. I thought I would keep following that. And I saw in the catalog a class called The Psychology of Religion. And for some reason it intrigued me. And I took the class. And right after taking it, I decided, that I'm going to double major in psychology and religion. And there was a very interesting elderly man who was teaching most of the religion courses in that college, and I only stayed for 2 years, but because we could take our prerequisites any time in the 4 years that we were supposed to be there, I didn't spend any time taking the regular prerequisites, and I took all psychology and religion courses. And I remember thinking, well, they're all saying the same thing. So what is it all about? Why are there all different religions and they all seem to be saying the same thing? And I did particularly like what Jesus said. And but I became much more interested in drugs and alcohol and sex and rock and roll and all of that. So my pursuits intellectually kind of fell back. And so there's an important event that happened that actually is focused around taking drugs, that's directly connected to my Mehera Baba story, coming to Mehera Baba story. And so a friend of mine and I spent about 36 hours tripping on organic mescaline. And for me, it was an experience of having, as if I had spent my whole life up to that moment with black and white, silent movie of life, and suddenly, you know, it was 3, 4, 5D color, full quadraphonic sound, pulsating alive, and completely, of course, if you've had that experience, mind-blowing. And the significant thing happened, we were out all night long, and it was, dawn was coming. It was very foggy, and I was sitting in a big open field, and I heard a train whistle somewhere in the distance. And in my mind's eye, I saw myself get on that train, and I knew that I was leaving my life as I knew it. That, you know, my parents, my family, everything that I knew that I would call my life, I was leaving. And that I would never return. And I sat in that field and wept. And my girlfriend heard me weeping, and she came over, found me in the fog, and I told her, she asked me what was the matter, and I told her what had happened. And the sun was coming up, this fog was burning off, and finally we decided we needed to go home. So we did. Strangely enough, I never thought about it, about that incident. Just kind of left my consciousness, and I never thought about it. And then the next 10 years were very, very difficult. I dropped out of college. As I said, I got very involved in drugs and sex and rock and roll, and had to, you know, I just, because you quit school, you know, doing jobs, waitressing, gardening, anything to make money. Not a real productive time in my life. And a lot of heartbreak, you know, broken relationships. If you've been there, you know exactly what it was like. And I actually ended up going back to my hometown, spending time there, and eventually feeling so broken, would probably be the best word, that I actually went home and with my parents and stayed with my parents for a while. During that time, I had a friend who I knew in high school, who I knew she did more drugs than I did. And I thought she had really kind of fried her brain, so to speak. So I'm at my parents' house trying to figure out, how do you put together your life when it's all fallen apart and you just don't know what to do? And she comes into town, finds out I'm at my parents', and comes to visit me. And strangely enough, she seemed very together. And I said to her, hey, look, I know that you did more drugs than I did, so how come you seem together at the moment and I'm a wreck? And she told me, well, I have found God, I had an experience with Jesus, and I'm born again, that type of thing. And at the time, I didn't have the vaguest idea what she was talking about. So I encouraged her to tell me more because I was quite desperate and I wanted help also. So she told me, you give your life to Jesus. And I said, well, how do you do that? And she said, well, literally, you get down on your knees and you give your life to Jesus. I said, okay, I'll do it because I'm desperate. So I did. And then she proceeded to kind of tutor me on how to love God in this way. She gave me books to read, and I was supposed to read them and do exactly what they said, and I did because I was very desperate. And so, every morning I got down on my knees, I would give my life to God, and I would say these prayers, and she would bring me to church and all kinds of things like that. And I had a beautiful, authentic experience of falling head over heels in love with Jesus. And it was real to me. It was very heart-centered and joyful and healing. It was very healing. And I did run into some really kind of tough issues. The whole idea that there's God and there's the devil. And I had taken enough religion classes to know that this wasn't the only way to see the world, but my experience with Jesus was so authentic and so real, I was struggling to fit the pieces together into that. And at one point, I had the experience of witnessing a group of people count this young woman's sins, and I can look back to this now and know they were, doing the best they could to try and figure out what a good Christian life was, but I found it offensive and cruel, and it wasn't loving at all, and I had to walk away from involvement in this whole Christian life. And it was deeply disturbing because I couldn't figure out how to get Jesus out of that context. I knew that I loved Jesus, that Jesus loved me, and yet I had found him, so to speak, within the context of this whole Christian group, and pretty much had gotten a little brainwashed about, if you don't do it this way, then you're a sinner. So I decided I had to just try as many different things that I could to satisfy this feeling inside of me of having to have an intimate relationship with God. And another friend of mine lived in that area, and he was a Sufi of the Inayat Khan lineage, but had not Sufism reoriented, but Inayat Khan's son, Pir Vilayat. And he had, I guess, been initiated in several levels and whatever, because I don't really understand how all that works. But he could initiate me and my girlfriend and teach us meditations, etc. So I was interested. So he did do that with us. And so we had a commitment that every day she and I would get together and we would meditate and do the things that he told us to. So we did this day after day, day after day. And at one point, I was sitting, meditating, and the thought went through my mind, if this is the way to God, I will never get there. Because I was looking for this heart awakening and opening again that I had experienced with Jesus, and I wasn't getting any of that in this meditation. And I kept going back and saying to myself, Jesus had awakened me. How do I get back to him? And so during meditation, I would end up thinking those kind of thoughts rather than doing the meditation they told me to do. And one day I actually said, you know, Jesus said he was coming back. And I think enough time has gone by that I bet you he has come back. And I was very struck by that. And I thought, wow, well, how would I find him? And my dad happened to be a stockbroker. And so he had an office and he had a ticker tape actually in his office, and it was digital already. I think they might have had some of the first digital things, but suddenly across my mind's eye, the word avatar, literally like a ticker tape, goes past my mind's eye. I said, avatar. And I realized I knew what it meant, that it was somehow associated with Jesus coming again, because it followed right on that thought. And I thought, well, okay, well then I must need to find the avatar. And it just seemed like click, click, clicks, like the puzzle pieces fell together, and I knew that that's what I needed to do. And one of the things that they had taught us is a walking meditation, and you had to say a certain thing as you were doing it, but I stood up and I walked around this room and I said, I want the avatar, I want the avatar. And I turned to my friend, who was a little disturbed because I was interrupting her meditation, and I looked at her and I said, I'm done with this. I want the avatar. And I left. And there was no internet at the time, etc., so not a clue as to how.
What year was it?
I'm very bad with time, but I would say 70 at that point, because I went to India for the very first time New Year's Eve 1979. I had already been married a year, and so it had to be somewhere around 77, 78, something like that. And so one of the ways I supported myself in those years, as I was a model for artists. And there was a private group of teachers. They taught at the local high schools in the art departments. And I guess some of them were also probably just artists who needed models. So I was approached one day at church because the main art teacher went to that same church. And he asked me to do a whole series of weekly classes. They were, they wanted the same pose. So sure, I went. And from the moment I walked into this studio, I was completely absorbed by the fact that there were paintings, drawings, and photographs, all of the same person, all over the walls of this studio. And what was most startling to me is that I knew it was Meher Baba, but I couldn't figure out how I knew it was Meher Baba. And it was years later that I remembered that I had been out in California in a health food store. I had picked up a card with Meher Baba's picture on it, and I'd carried it in my wallet for years. Whatever happened with it, I have no idea, but I did piece that together later on. But it was very weird to be standing all night long looking at these photos and paintings and drawings and knowing that it was Meher Baba and not having the vaguest idea how I knew. And I remember during the breaks, there on a table was a book, The Beloved, and it was mostly photographs of Meher Baba. I remember standing there and paging through this book, staring at the pictures. So then when the class was over, I let everyone else leave, and I was waiting to talk to the man who owned the studio because I wanted to know why he had all these pictures of Meher Baba all over the walls. So when I asked him, he went, "Oh, are you a Baba lover?" I said, "No, I have no idea what that even is. Who's Meher Baba?" And he looked rather dumbfounded at me. And then he said, "Well, let's see. Meher Baba. Well, let's see. Meher Baba, and he's hemming and hawing like this." And I finally say to him, "Well, spit it out. Who is Meher Baba? Why do you have these pictures all over your studio?" And he looks me right in the face and he goes, "Meher Baba's the avatar." And I went, "Oh, that's exactly what I'm looking for." And he goes, You are? How do you even know what that means? You don't know what that means." And I said, "No, I think I do know what that means." And I said, "As a matter of fact, I want to borrow that book that you have on your table over there with all the pictures." And he says, "Oh, no, I use that every day. I'm drawing from painting." "No, you can't. But I'll give you another book," he says. And he hands me Tales of the New Life. So I just take it and I go home, and there's only about 2 pictures, I think, in that whole book. And I had no interest in reading. I just wanted the photographs. So I went back the next week because they had hired me for like 4 weeks or something. And I hand him the Tales of the New Life and I say, "The other book, that's the book that I want to borrow." And he said, "I can only let you have it for 2 or 3 days at the most." I said, "Fine, no problem. Please let me take it." And so I take it and I just keep paging through this book and looking at the pictures. I can't even honestly recall my experience beyond that. there's some words in that book. There is some, ongoing thing, but I don't remember much of it at all. And so I had several weeks of going to this studio and looking at all these paintings and drawings and photographs of Mehera Baba. And then I began to talk to this guy, of course, about Mehera Baba. And so I want it to be true. I want it to be true that Mehera Baba is who he said he was, that he is the avatar, that he was Ram and Buddha and Christ. And it's like, I want that to be true. And yet, I'm scared because I don't want to go through an experience again, like with Jesus, of falling in love. And I mean, I did my best to do exactly what those people told me to do, to be a good Christian, and I was terribly hurt and disappointed. So, there's a little push-pull, fear, yearning there for me. And so I keep reading every book this guy will give me, and he's got a pretty good collection at that time for what existed. And I'm reading all these books, and I'm getting frustrated because I want proof, some kind of proof. So I happen one night, I go into the bathroom to change my clothes, and there's a Baba book in there, and I happen to pick it up, and I read. This man is speaking, and he said, I lived for 5 years with Mehera Baba before I believed that he was who he said he is, or that he is who he said he was. And it struck me, and I put the book down, and there was a picture of Mehera Baba in that bathroom, and I turned to that picture of Mehera Baba and I said, well, if that guy actually lived with you for 5 years before you made it clear who you are, then I don't have to rush. I know, and I said this, I think I even probably shook my finger. I know what God's love feels like in my heart, and you can't fool me. So that will be my proof, so to speak. And I don't have to rush, because I was pressuring myself to make a decision, type of thing. So I felt very relieved by that experience. And so, long story short, I ended up marrying this man. And I think a year after we were married, we decided we would go to India. So of course we did the needful of going to India, meaning, work your job, save your money. We both had 2 jobs, and because we went to the center many times. Kitty said, well, yes, of course, you must go to India. Just get another job and save the money and go. And so we did. So we got to India, and before we even reached Meherabad, I was already sick. We had spent one night in Bombay at Nargis Dada Chanji's house, and had gone to eat in a little place around the corner, and apparently I got sick. It wasn't intestinal sick. To this day, who could describe something when, I felt like my skin was so sensitive I couldn't even hardly stand a bed sheet on my body, and I was just exhausted. So everyone else in the morning, we were staying at Vilu Villas, and everyone was getting into rickshaws and going out to Meherabad, and I was sitting in the garden sipping sherbet, as they say, and I was all by myself because everyone else would go, and this little servant guy, Raju, would bring me anything I wanted. But I didn't do much but drink. And my experience was all audio. I heard the wooden bullock carts on the streets, and I heard birds that I couldn't identify, and were, who knows what they even look like because I didn't even see them. And then the call to worship in the mosque, and bells around the cows' necks, and it seemed like only the sounds of India were really present for me. I mean, I remember it was, the greenery and the things that were growing were all different, but it was all about sound. And finally, one day, I feel well. And I say, okay, I'm going to go to Meherabad now. And I wasn't even talking to people at night. I would just go to bed and sleep. So I didn't even know what people were doing out at Meherabad. So I go out to Meherabad, and of course everyone walks up to the tomb, Baba's tomb, and I kind of watch what's happening so I know what to do. So as we approached, Nanakar was at the Samadhi then, at the tomb, and he would say, "Welcome home," and embrace us. And I remember when he hugged me and said, "Welcome home," I started to choke up. And I come from a pretty stoic family, so I was like choking it down, like I'm not going to stand there and cry or something, So then I watch people go in the Samadhi, bow down, and at that time you could still sit on the second layer of where the marble in Baba's Samadhi is. And so there were, 3, 6, 9, 12 people could fit in the Samadhi. And so I watched, you bow down and you sit down. So I bowed down and I sat down, and I thought, what are we supposed to do in here anyway? And then I went, oh no! Meditation? Because I already was like, I can't meditate. And I remember just immediately I felt kind of crestfallen, like, oh no. And then something inside of me goes, eh. So this calm sense comes over me and says, hey, don't worry. You've been just sitting in that garden for the past few days, listening to the birds and the sounds of India. Just listen, And at that time there were a lot of birds around the Samadhi, which is not true now. And so I thought, oh, okay, I know how to do that. I've been just doing that for several days. Fine, I can do that. So I'm just listening to the birds. And so I'm really focused on my hearing. And the next thing I know, the train goes by Lower Meherabad and blows the whistle. And that scene from 10 years prior, when we were tripping on Mescaline and getting on that train and leaving my life as I knew it, that goes whoosh, just flies through my mind like it was yesterday, and I remember it perfectly. And then I see myself getting off of this train. I'm jumping off the train, and I'm running pell-mell up the hill, and Baba is standing at the top of the hill, and his arms are out like this, and he's smiling, and he's so happy, and he says, "Welcome home." And of course, I just dissolve in the samadhi. I don't know how long I sat in there weeping and saying and realizing, of course he's who he says he is. If he can unite those incidences within me and meet me in this place exactly, it was so orchestrated perfectly. So I eventually come out of the samadhi, and I'm kind of reeling, like, wow. I mean, I had no idea how Baba was going to show me who he was, but that was incredible. And yet I could, so that my heart now is in that place, but now my mind wants to know something, I don't know what. Somehow I get over to the library, and it's quite different than it is now, but there was a picture of Buddha in there. I don't know, but I went into the library, and I was staring at pictures of Baba and a picture of Buddha, and suddenly, my experience of taking religion classes and reading spiritual text and things, I began to see how the avatar is the one and same soul who comes again and again. So my intellect got satisfied. And so I hadn't been to Mehera. So, I mean, I'm such a different person today than I was back then. Kind of naive, but a New Yorker, kind of tough. And so we go to Mehera to meet the Mandali. And I've read the book at that time that was published by, I think Nashuan published this book about the Mandali. So I know that Mehera is the purest soul in the universe. And so I didn't sit up on the porch. I sat on a bench away from the porch. And at that point, it was, what did I say? Oh yeah, we came over New Year's Eve, 1979, so it's 1980. And Mehera giggled a lot. And like I said, I came from a Stoic family, New Yorkers, and I was horrified that my first kind of conscious assessment of Mehera, I literally thought, she's a twit. I mean, and then I'm like, oh my God, Baba says she's a pure soul in the universe, and this is my response, like, oh my God, what am I going to do, So I'm really determined that I have to figure out how to see who Mehera is. So I go to the cabin when she goes in the cabin and offering flowers and, just watching her, observing her, like a little kid trying to learn something. And I remember I got some roses, and then one non-Mehera day, I was at Vilu's. There wasn't many people around. I locked myself in the bathroom, and I was took the roses that I had and I imitated Mehera. And I would kiss the roses and I would trace Baba's face and Baba darling, I love you. I mean, I was literally imitating her. I had been studying her. And I kept it up and kept it up, and then finally I went, oh my God, she's totally in love with him. like surprise. But I was a very romantic person and I loved being in love. So this was a wonderful revelation to me that she was just like not so crazy in love with him. And so for me, that was like, I got it, and then I could kind of join in and be more participatory in hanging out with Mehera. And I asked her if she would, I wanted to have some kind of intimate moment with her, but I wasn't a real talkative kind of person, and questions were not my forte. So I actually ripped a button off of my skirt and said, Mehera, and somebody told me that Baba liked his buttons sewn on in a certain way. Could you show me how to sew on the button? And she agreed, and we sat down, and she said, Baba didn't have any certain way that he liked buttons sewed on, just as long as they were sewed on really well. I went, oh, okay. And then she said, do you really not know how to sew on a button? And I said, no, I do know how to sew on a button, but I want you to show me how to sew on a button. So she did. She showed me how to sew on a button. And so such is the way of learning the ropes of how to be kind of comfortable and intimate and unafraid to what would I say? To show feelings and to be honest and really vulnerable. And I think that's one of the greatest things that Baba has actually shown me in my life, is to be natural, be honest, and kind and loving. It certainly wasn't where I came from, and I lived with a lot of fear and doubts and a lot of fear. And his love has changed all of that. I don't know what else to say. Jai Baba. Yeah, of course. Done.